The chants started before the opening tip. That was the part that separated this from ordinary hostility, the part that made the arena in Sacramento on a Tuesday night in March 2004 something different from the standard theater of road game antagonism that every professional athlete learns to navigate as a condition of their profession. This was not the ambient noise of a crowd cheering for their team. This was organized. This was coordinated. This was a building full of people who had decided before the game began that their primary purpose that evening was not to watch basketball, but to break something. And the something they had chosen to break was Kobe Bryant. Sacramento in 2004 had reasons that felt, from inside that city and that fan base, like legitimate grievances. The Kings and the Lakers had been engaged for 3 years in a rivalry that carried the specific heat of a competition where both sides believed the other had taken something that belonged to them. The 2002 Western Conference Finals, the officiating controversy, the years of accumulated tension between two franchises whose best versions of themselves seemed to require the other's failure. The crowd that filled that building on that Tuesday night carried all of it, had been carrying it through the season, and had reached a point where the arrival of Kobe Bryant in their arena was less a basketball event than an opportunity for a kind of collective expression that sports uniquely permits. They were loud before the anthem finished. They were something beyond loud by tip-off. What they were chanting is less important than the quality of the chanting, the sustained organization of it, the way it rose and fell with a rhythm that suggested rehearsal, that suggested people who had come prepared with the specific intention of making one man feel the full weight of their contempt. It was personal in a way that crowd noise rarely achieves. It had his name in it. It had references to things that had happened off the court, to the events of the previous summer that had been in every newspaper and every sports broadcast, and that had given people who wanted reasons to hate Kobe Bryant more reasons than they needed. The crowd used all of it. They used it loudly, and they used it without restraint, and they used it from the first minute to the last, with the commitment of people who believe that what they are doing serves a purpose. Kobe Bryant heard every word. This is not an assumption. This is something he confirmed years later, in one of those interviews where enough time has passed that the honest answer and the strategic answer have become the same answer. He heard it, and he understood it, and he walked onto that court carrying it the way he carried everything that arrived from outside, as information, as data, as something to be processed and filed and eventually used. He did not look into the crowd. He did not acknowledge the chants with any visible response. He went through his warm-up with the same sequence he always used, the same footwork, the same release point, the same expression that the Sacramento crowd would have read as arrogance. And that was, in fact, something more complicated and more interior than arrogance. It was the face of a man who had already decided something and was simply waiting for the game to begin so the deciding could become doing. Phil Jackson sat at the end of the bench during warm-ups and watched his team and watched the crowd and watched Kobe in the particular way. He watched Kobe before games where the external pressure had reached a level that would have destabilized a different player. He had a theory about Kobe and external pressure that he had developed over years of close observation and that he had never fully articulated publicly because some things about great competitors are better understood than explained. The theory was simple. Most players performed despite pressure. Kobe performed because of it. Not in the motivational poster sense, not in the way that phrase is used to describe athletes who try harder when the stakes are higher. In a more specific and more unsettling sense, the pressure seemed to clarify something in him, to strip away the unnecessary, to reduce the game to its essential components, and allow him to operate within those components with a precision that normal conditions, paradoxically, made more difficult to access. A building full of people trying to humiliate him was not a hostile environment for Kobe Bryant. It was a particular kind of fuel that very few engines are built to process. The first quarter was tight, in the way first quarters are tight, when both teams understand that the game matters and neither wants to reveal too much too early. The Kings were good that year, genuinely good. A team built on ball movement and collective intelligence and the specific chemistry that develops when a group of players has competed together long enough to anticipate each other without needing to communicate. They ran their offense with the fluency of a well-rehearsed argument, each pass finding the next position before the defense had finished adjusting to the previous one. The crowd was with them on every possession, rising on every Kings score. descending on every Kobe touch with the organized hostility that had been the building's texture since before tip-off. Kobe had 11 points at the end of the first quarter. Efficient, unspectacular, the kind of first quarter that would not have produced a highlight and would not have alarmed anyone watching the box score update in real time. What would not have been visible in the box score was the quality of his attention during those 12 minutes, the way he moved without the ball, the way he watched the Kings' defense in the possessions where he was not the primary option, cataloging the rotations, the help side positioning, the specific habits of the two defenders most likely to be assigned to him in the moments that would matter. He was, in the first quarter, a student. The classroom was hostile and loud and personally directed at him, and he was taking notes. By halftime, the Lakers trailed by 6, and the Sacramento crowd was in the full register of a building that believes it is winning something larger than the game. There is a specific quality to that kind of crowd energy, the way it becomes self-reinforcing, the way each successful possession adds to a collective confidence that begins to feel like inevitability. The chants had not diminished. If anything, they had grown more specific, more pointed, feeding on the scoreboard the way fires feed on the material conditions that sustain them. In the visiting locker room, Phil Jackson spoke calmly about the defensive breakdowns that had produced the deficit, about the second chance points that the Kings had converted, about the transition situations where the Lakers had been consistently late. He spoke about these things, and then he stopped and looked at his team and said something that one of the assistant coaches present that evening recalled years later in a documentary that covered that period of Lakers basketball. He said, "The crowd is playing for them tonight. We need someone to play louder than the crowd." He did not say Kobe's name. He did not need to. Kobe was sitting with the stillness that Phil had learned to read over years as the specific precursor to a second half that would be different in kind from the first, not just in execution, but in quality, in the register at which the game would be played. He was not angry. That was the thing that surprised people who expected anger in that situation, who would have understood anger as the natural response to what the crowd had been delivering since before tip-off. He was not angry. He was still. And the stillness had the quality of something that had been gathering since the first chant before the anthem and was now fully formed and waiting for the correct moment to become action. The third quarter began, and within 3 minutes the Sacramento crowd had gone through a transition that crowds in that situation rarely fully anticipate. They had come prepared to sustain their hostility through 48 minutes, and they were discovering that the hostility was encountering something it had not budgeted for. Kobe scored 9 points in the first 5 minutes of the third quarter, and each score had a quality that was different from the first half scores. Not in the mechanics were the same, but in the intention behind them, in the sense that each one was directed, was addressed to something, was a sentence in a response that had been composing itself since before the game started. The crowd did not go quiet. They could not afford to go quiet. The going quiet would have been its own acknowledgement. But the quality of the noise shifted, became slightly more defensive, slightly less certain of the inevitability it had been projecting. Phil Jackson noticed this from the bench, noticed the shift in the crowd's texture before the scoreboard fully reflected its cause. He had watched enough basketball in enough buildings to understand that crowds have a momentum of their own that operates parallel to the game's momentum, and that sometimes precedes it, and that when a crowd's momentum begins to turn, the game's momentum usually follows within a few possessions. He said nothing to Kobe during the timeout at the 5-minute mark of the third. He looked at him, and Kobe was already looking at the floor with the focused vacancy of someone running calculations that require the external world to be temporarily suspended. Phil drew up the next possession on his whiteboard and put Kobe in the place where the ball would end up and trusted what he had learned over years to do what instructions could not. The possessions that followed in the third quarter and into the fourth were the kind that defy adequate description, because the adequate description requires the full technical vocabulary of basketball and the full emotional vocabulary of theater, and neither alone is sufficient. Kobe was doing things that were individually explicable. Each move had a name. Each decision had a logic that a good analyst could reconstruct in the film session the next morning. But the accumulation of them, the sustained, relentless, architecturally coherent accumulation of correct decisions made at the speed of elite competition against a defense that was doing everything correctly, and being insufficient anyway, that accumulation produced something that exceeded the sum of its technical components. It produced the feeling, in everyone watching, of witnessing something that had been inevitable since before the game began and was only now arriving at its visible form. The Lakers took the lead with 9 minutes remaining in the fourth quarter, and the building went through the specific acoustic transition of a crowd that has been loud for the wrong reasons and is now processing the cost of having been wrong. It did not go silent. Crowds like that do not go silent because silence is itself a form of concession, and the people in that building had not come prepared to concede anything. But the sound changed. The organized quality left it. The chants lost their rhythm. What remained was noise without architecture, loud but structureless, the sound of people responding to events rather than directing them, which is a fundamentally different sound, and every player on that floor could feel the difference. Kobe scored 18 points in the fourth quarter. The final number when the game ended with the Lakers ahead by 5 was 42 points on a night when the building had opened by trying to make him feel like less than what he was, and had closed by being forced to watch him be exactly what he was, fully and without apology, in a register that left no interpretive room, no space for the crowd to locate its contempt in anything that the game itself had provided. The contempt had arrived with reasons. The game had addressed every one of them, not by answering them in the way that arguments are answered, with counter-evidence and rhetorical force, by doing what Kobe Bryant did when the conditions were exactly these, by playing basketball at a level that made the reasons feel, by the final buzzer, like a different conversation from a different evening. In the corridor after the game, a reporter asked him about the crowd, about the chants, about the specific personal quality of the hostility that the building had sustained for 48 minutes. Kobe looked at the reporter for a moment with the expression he wore when a question had not yet earned a complicated answer. He said, "I heard them." Then he said, "I always hear everything." Then he picked up his bag and walked toward the bus, and the corridor emptied, and the arena, which had been so loud for so long, was by then almost completely quiet. Phil Jackson sat on the bus and wrote 4 lines in his coaching journal and did not show them to anyone for years. What he wrote was about the relationship between hostility and excellence, about the specific version of Kobe Bryant that appeared when the external world was at its most aggressive, about whether that version was the result of the pressure, or whether the pressure was simply the condition that allowed something always present to become fully visible. He wrote that he did not know the answer and that not knowing was itself a kind of answer. And then he wrote the last line, which was the line that the documentary quoted years later, and that people who followed that Lakers team through that difficult season recognized as the most accurate thing that could have been said about what they had watched on that Tuesday night in Sacramento. He wrote, "They came to break him, and instead they showed everyone, including themselves, exactly how unbreakable he was." The Kings won the division that year. The rivalry continued in the way great rivalries continue, carrying its history into each new chapter, accumulating meaning with each encounter. But that Tuesday night in March existed separately from the rivalry's larger narrative, existed as its own complete thing, sealed by the final buzzer and the 5-point margin, and the 42 points, and the crowd that had arrived with the organized intention of making one man small, and had spent 48 minutes watching him be large in ways they had not prepared for, and could not, by the end, pretend they had not seen. The chants had started before the opening tip. By the fourth quarter, they had become something else entirely, had become the sound of people who understood, too late to change it, that the thing they had tried to use against him had become the thing he used to become more precisely and completely himself. That is what great competitors do with contempt. They do not deflect it, they do not absorb it, they convert it, quietly, without announcement, into exactly the kind of fuel their particular engine was built to burn.